The Australian economy is set to slow markedly over coming decades as the population ages. Qantas facing class action over COVID credits and get set for a hike in insurance premiums. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, after the show, you've got a really interesting conversation coming up with Rob Talevsky, who is the CEO of Webull Australia.
Yeah, it's all about investing in China, like in Chinese equities, companies like Alibaba and Yum China, which is the owner of KFC and some of those sorts of brands in China. We talk about why invest directly into Chinese equities. We talk about some of the risks. We talk about the role Beijing and the Communist Party plays. But just, Rob's point at the end of the day is if you're a retail investor, you want a broad horizon or a broad range of things to invest in. And so we talk about directly investing in Chinese equities. Really fascinating chat.
Yeah, and of course, we're not an investing podcast, so need to get professional advice before you make any kind of investment decisions. I like the fact, Sean, that you talked about BYD, which is the EV manufacturer, which we spoke about weeks and weeks ago now. And it's one of those things that as soon as you mentioned it, now I can't stop seeing them everywhere.
Yeah. So Rob said that too. Rob said he hadn't really noticed BYD much, and then he was in China in March and realised what a big company it is. Came back to Australia and he said BYDs are everywhere. He just hadn't recognised them until he went to China.
Yeah, it's a really good interview. It's coming up later on. Well worth sticking around for. The main story this morning, though, Sean, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers says Australia's economic growth rate will slow over coming decades thanks to an ageing population.
It's part of the intergenerational report due for release on Thursday. The report will say that Australia's economy will be 2.5 times larger in 40 years' time than now. What's significant about that is it suggests economic growth will be slower in coming decades, averaging around 2.2% per year, rather than the 3.1% rate of the last 4 decades. The key reason, an ageing population. Chalmers yesterday said governments need to get policy settings right to ensure Australia is a major beneficiary rather than a victim of the different shifts underway. He said the intergenerational report will consider globalisation to fragmentation, hydrocarbons to renewables, IT to AI, and what all that means for younger and older Australians, our industrial base, and particularly the care economy. Also yesterday, the government released the first tranche of its draft petroleum resource rent tax legislation. Chalmers said the government had taken a responsible, methodical approach to tax reform to fund priorities such as strengthening Medicare and bulk billing. But he conceded the government needs to take a much broader and more modern approach to lifting productivity. On opposition leader Peter Dutton's comment yesterday morning that giving a union representative a seat on the Reserve Bank board would threaten its independence, Chalmers called the comment antagonistic. What I thought was really interesting about yesterday, Jim Chalmers talking, is we're getting down to some serious policy reform around tax in terms of the draft petroleum resource rent tax and in terms of really big picture vision for what Australia wants to be 20, 30, 40 years' time.
Yeah, big picture. That's how I was going to describe it because really these are, you've just kind of rattled off kind of half a dozen major things that this report covers.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting when it's released on Thursday. And the government is drip feeding it. This morning it's told us about the 2.2% economic growth rate. We'll probably get more in the next few days. It will be fascinating because even though you might say, look, 40 years of 2.2%, how do you know? It kind of sets a guideline for people to make investment decisions around, and that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sean, yesterday the business community also presented its blueprint for the future economy.
Yes, so the Business Council of Australia is urging the Albanese government to narrow the focus of its $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund and turn it into a transformative industry policy, something like the Biden administration's $500 billion package of industry subsidies. We're a long way from that, but still, that's what the BCA is talking about. It wants Labor to concentrate funding on 10 to 15 precincts of significance, things like quantum technologies, hydrogen, semiconductors, vaccines, green energy, and defence manufacturing. The Business Council says that lifting economic growth from 2.3% a year to that long-run average of 3.3% needs much more than an industry policy. It also needs a full suite of reforms across the economy, including tax, industrial relation, skills, and fiscal policy.
All right. How did local markets perform yesterday?
Well, the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.5% to 7,116 points. That's on top of the 2% plus drop last week. Now, like last week, most of the big movers reflected earnings results. Otherwise, CSL was a poor performer, dropping 1.4%. The banks generally underperformed. Westpac tumbled most, more on that shortly, while Commonwealth Bank, National Australia Bank and ANZ all ended lower. Telstra, Rio Tinto, QBE and James Hardie all underperformed the market. Some of the better players, at least among the large caps, included Aristocrat Leisure, Santos and Woodside, the energy giants, Wesfarmers, Fortescue Metals Group and Macquarie Group.
And what's happening on international markets?
All about China at the moment. That's been the theme for the last couple of weeks. Chinese banks yesterday made a smaller than expected cut to their benchmark lending rate. Disappointing investors, really. They also avoided trimming the reference rate for mortgages. Now, what all that boils down to is that the Central Bank of China had been putting pressure on lenders to boost loans. The fact that the banks aren't cutting rates by more kind of works against that. Otherwise, oil and gold prices were steady over the past 24 hours or so. Aussie dollar dipped below 64 US cents. It's buying about that amount currently.
All right. There is plenty going on. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, AGL Energy has done a deal with the Victorian government to keep the Loy Yang A coal-fired power station running until 2035, even though its 10% shareholder, software billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes, wants to shut the generator much earlier.
Large coal-fired power plants still provide most of Victoria's energy, and the deal puts greater certainty around generation and when fossil fuel plants will ultimately close. Victorian Energy Minister Lily D'Ambrosio said the binding deal provides 12 years' notice of the closure, providing some certainty over future generation levels and the economics around new renewable energy entering the market. Also yesterday, Energy Australia said it would shift its big coal-fired generator near Lithgow in New South Wales into a backup role and cease running it as a base load plant well ahead of its 2040 closure date. Now, it's part of a $5 billion climate action plan announced by Energy Australia, which is intended to put the energy company on course for net zero scope 1 and 2 emissions at least by 2050. What all this does is provide some certainty. Loy Yang will continue operating for longer, so there'll be critics of that. The Energy Australia generator near Lithgow will close earlier. The benefit, though, is we know what's happening, and uncertainty is a real problem for business. So this is kind of good, at least, that we know what's going to happen.
Well, it kind of goes back to the lead story today, Sean, and the point that you made about how at least this kind of gives a pathway and it gives a framework and people kind of know where they are going.
Yes,
for the foreseeable future, which is actually one of the main lessons I've taken out of this entire kind of podcast series, working on Fear and Greed with you, that you have kind of repeated that to me a number of times, enough times for it to sink in, that business needs certainty in order to function.
That's right.
So I'm just writing that down. On the same topic, Sean, one of the country's largest emitters, BlueScope, will spend $1.2 billion relining its blast furnace at its Port Kembla Steelworks, saying that old school steel making is with us for at least another decade.
Australia's largest steelworks boss, Mark Vassella, said large-scale commercial production of low-carbon steel is still at least a decade away, with more breakthroughs in technology needed. He also added that momentum to cut emissions in the steel industry was greater now than he thought possible a couple of years ago. The company said net profit for the year to the end of June tumbled 64% to $1 billion on the back of falling steel prices and profit margins. Now, to be honest, that 64% is the big drop, but they had such a cracking year last year. It didn't exactly disappoint investors. In fact, the company's share price jumped 3.5% on the news. Overall, the US operations had a poor year, but in contrast, the ColourBond steel roofing products business here in Australia delivered record sales.
QANTAS is facing a class action lawsuit alleging it violated consumer laws when it failed to refund customers for flights cancelled because of the pandemic.
The class action alleges that Qantas engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct, focusing on the manner in which Qantas communicated with its customers in early 2020 about their options in respect of flights that could not proceed due to COVID-19 travel restrictions. According to the Financial Review, the action alleges that Qantas has been unjustly enriched by holding a very significant quantum of customer funds that it ought to have refunded. The airline has disclosed it's still sitting on $400 million worth of COVID credits that belong to customers in Australia. Of course, that number will be updated in the next couple of days when Qantas reports, but it's a fair argument one way or the other.
Indeed. Now, Westpac made a net profit of $1.8 billion during the June quarter, saying there's been a, quote, modest deterioration in bad debts and a jump in expenses reflecting inflationary pressures.
Significantly, there was also a contraction in lending margins due to mortgage competition. Its core net interest margin, essentially the difference between what Westpac pays on deposits and what it receives on loans, was down slightly for the quarter, showing that even though interest rates are rising, competition in the mortgage market is fierce enough to keep a rein on profits. The results in line with expectations, but the bank share price fell nearly 3%, with big investors noting the higher cost growth number. The number of mortgage customers in Australia who are more than 90 days overdue on loan repayments rose just a touch, and the bank recorded some higher stressed loans in the property, retail and agriculture sectors.
Sean, there are big changes afoot at Premier Investments, which is the owner of Peter Alexander at Smiggle and Just Jeans, Portman, Jackie E, bunch of shops, with relatively recent CEO Richard Murray leaving the business. We've talked a lot about Richard Murray because he's a bit of a rock star CEO.
He is. I mean, he was, of course, running JB Hi-Fi until he joined Premier 2 years ago. What happens? It looks like major shareholder Solomon Lew is getting ready to shake up the retailer and considering splitting Premier into a bunch of different companies. He may potentially demerge Smiggle, for example. So we'll have a children's products company. He may demerge Peter Alexander. So we'll have a pajama company. Big investors say the corporate structure of Premier at the moment is holding back both those two retailers in particular. They liked yesterday's announcement, pushing the group's share price up 13%. The decision for Murray to leave, though, was a surprise. The analysts are speculating that there's been a divergence between Murray and Lew about the direction of the group. Meanwhile, the company upped its earnings guidance, with sales up for the 12 months to the end of July by nearly 10%.
It looks like insurance premiums are set to rise, Sean, with IAG, which owns brands NRMA and CGU, hinting at price increases.
Alas, surprise, surprise. So after some pretty tough years for insurance companies, things are certainly on the up. IAG's profit for the 12 months to the end of June hit $832 million. The previous year it was just $347 million. A few things going on there, Michael. Investment markets were much stronger. Now, remember, insurance companies take your premium, they invest the money, and then they pay out as necessary. That means they're holding on to a lot of cash that they can invest. Markets are better, hence they make more money. Also, last year was relatively benign weather-wise, and that means the insurers didn't have to pay out as much. Also, they've been able to push through much higher premium increases. IAG said those increases are likely to continue. Interesting. Meanwhile, health insurer NIB announced a jump in its underlying profit, sending its share price up 5% yesterday. And yep, its boss also said premiums will rise.
Isn't it funny to think how much of an impact the weather can have on companies? I mean, you think about agricultural businesses and things and you understand the impact of the weather, but then you get a relatively kind of benign year, as you put it. And suddenly the insurance companies all benefit.
Yeah, and think of the miners. The bad weather can really hurt the miners as well. Yeah. There's plenty of industries, wet weather and cold weather affects the retailers because people buy more winter clothing or less winter clothing and when the weather actually happens. And weather's fascinating, Michael.
It actually is. It's sometimes hard to tell whether you are being serious or not, because you do have a tendency on occasion to be a little bit sarcastic, but I'm choosing to take this as genuine. And so I agree, weather is fascinating. See, still, I don't know. Even that was kind of a little bit ambiguous. So we're going to move on. There were plenty of other profit results yesterday. Sean, Ampol said its core profit in the 6 months to June tumbled 26%.
Yes, the reason was a breakdown at its only oil refinery. Otherwise, the result was pretty strong, according to Chief Executive Matt Halliday. Ampol, which was formerly known as Caltex, cut its first half dividend, though. Its share price rose nearly 4%. Financial software and data firm Iris shares tumbled 35% after it cut its full-year earnings guidance and suspended dividends. The company's June half results were weaker than expected, partly due to higher costs. The group will sell its managed funds administration business to pay down debt. Still, 35% drop on the day you announced your results. Ouch, that's got to hurt. One of my favourite companies, Breville, its share price jumped 10% after it said new product launches and an ability to pass through price rises helped it navigate weaker consumer demand during the last half. This whole concept of being able to push up your price, investors love that, and companies that can do that are being rewarded. That's what happened with Breville yesterday. The opposite there, retailer Adairs reported a jump in sales for the last year, but its share price tumbled 16%. Outdoor advertising group oMedia reported a 7% jump in revenue, sending its share price up 6%. Away from profit results, Elders' share price fell 11% after it downgraded its profit forecasts, citing weaker than expected sales. And A2 Milk shares plunged 14% after it warned that its key China market this year will be more challenging, with a further double-digit decline in value expected. For the last financial year, it announced sales growth of 10%.
All right, international news time now, Sean, and Beijing is investigating a Chinese national accused of spying for the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the country's state security ministry said yesterday.
The 39-year-old Chinese national, surnamed Huao, was a cadre at a ministry and had gone to Japan for studies, which was where the spying recruitment occurred, the ministry said. 2 weeks ago, the ministry said it had uncovered another national, also suspected of spying for the CIA, after being recruited in Italy. This is all according to Reuters. The ministry said Huao had become acquainted with a US embassy official known as Ted. I love that. Ted. While sorting out a visa application, he invited Huao for dinners, presented gifts, and sought Huao's help with writing a paper that Ted promised to pay for. That's all according to the ministry. Very John le Carre, don't you reckon?
Yeah, Ted is such a CIA name, isn't it?
Isn't it?
It's fantastic. Do you reckon you get to pick your own name if you're a CIA operative?
Maybe.
I'm going to be Bruno.
Well, I can think of the movies involving Bruno or Ted.
Yeah. All right. Maybe we should move on. It's actually a very serious story, but
it is very serious.
Donald Trump, Sean, will skip this week's first Republican presidential debate, arguing that Americans know him well, so there's no need for a public showdown with his rivals for the White House. Well, that's one approach to it.
He might have a point. In a message on his platform Truth Social, Trump touted what he called a hugely successful record as president and what he described as his popularity among the American people. That's according to AFP. Now, the first debate in the race for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination is scheduled for tomorrow night, US time. In his post, Trump noted the latest in a wave of polls showing him in front of the rest of the Republican field. A CBS News poll over the weekend said 62% of those polled for the survey would vote for Trump, even though he has been indicted 4 times this year. Rewriting the rules, Donald Trump, once again.
Yeah, he sure is. Now, Sean, this last story, how about this? A large chunk of ice fell from the sky and hit a house in Massachusetts in the US, apparently after it fell off the body of an aircraft overhead.
So no one was injured, but it made a mighty hole in the roof of a house. It seems the 6 to 9 kilo ice chunk came off a plane travelling to Boston Logan Airport. That's according to Bloomberg. A couple heard a very loud bang, ran upstairs to see if their children were okay. They were okay. And then noticed debris falling from an upper roof onto a lower roof. It was a bunch of ice chunks, which apparently had come from a plane.
You'd have to be disappointed, wouldn't you, to realise that it's ice? You'd think if it's going to make that much damage, I mean, the ice is going to melt, it's going to be nothing. If that was a meteorite, right?
Or an engine.
Then you are sitting on a gold mine. I mean, and ice is like, that's a booby prize, and a chunk of ice, because it's going to melt and it's going to wreck the carpet as well because it's going to be wet. But if you get a meteorite, you've got some obscure kind of interstellar metal sitting in your house, you are set.
Potentially radioactive, Michael.
That's also a risk, Sean.
It's a risk-reward program, Fear and Greed.
That it is, Sean. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You're speaking with Rob Talevsky, the CEO of Webull Australia.
All about risk-reward, and in this case, investing in Chinese equities. Great chat with Rob about what to think about if you want to invest directly in China.
Yeah, it's a good chat. It's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.